Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we head to the farm to examine some of the man-made challenges faced by farmers trying to put food on our table. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Martha Bonita from Paris, Virginia, a small family farmer whose run-in with local zoning regulators culminated in a statewide right-to-farm bill that bears her name. But first, Dr. Pamela Ronald, a plant geneticist at UC Davis and author of Tomorrow's Table, Organic Farming, Genetics, and the Future of Food, describes why GMO foods and organic farming are actually made for each other. Professor Ronald, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Professor, genetic engineering technologies used to make GMO crops are usually presented in the press as being diametrically opposed to organic farming. Why do you think otherwise?
Yeah, you often hear that genetics and organic farming represent polar opposites of the agricultural spectrum, but I don't agree with that. And the reason is we both have the same goal, which is an ecologically based system of farming. And organic farmers rely on genetically improved seed, and of course, seed alone will not solve all agricultural problems. The farming practices are very, very important.
And different kinds of practices are different for different kinds of scale in farming. Is that not right?
That's actually not true so much anymore. There's some very massive organic farms for some specialty crops, and there are conventional farms that are very tiny. And then you have subsistence farms, which can be very small, which can use a lot of integrated approaches. So it's very difficult to generalize as to small or large when you're talking about a particular farming system.
Let's dig into the science a little bit and look at food. I mean, how many of the foods that we eat, both plant and animal, are found in nature totally unmodified by man?
Virtually everything we eat is modified in some manner, and perhaps some exceptions here on the west coast of California. It's salmon fishing season, so our local fisher people catch king salmon, which is completely unaltered. And then we also can go to the coastal hills and collect chanterelles. On the East Coast, perhaps, you can collect blueberries, but everything else is grown in artificial systems called farms and has been genetically altered over the centuries through different methods of genetic techniques.
How does crossbreeding and traditional animal husbandry and other earlier techniques, which move genes around to enhance the food properties of plants and animals, how does that differ from modern genetic engineering?
Modern genetic engineering focuses on a single gene or perhaps a couple genes and identifies genes that are very well characterized and then moves them into a plant using a specific, there's a couple different techniques that might be used. And you can move a rice gene into a rice plant, but you can also move a bacterial gene into a rice plant. So that's something that's new. Is not typically done with conventional types of breeding.
And why do people find that scary?
I think people find it scary because the idea of putting an animal or a bacterial gene into a plant strikes them as being something almost supernatural, and they may not be aware that this type of genetic engineering occurs in nature where there are bacteria that infect plants and transfer their genes into plants. And also, genes are very similar. So we can take two different plant genes. They can be virtually identical but have very dramatically different functions. And bacterial genes and animal genes can be very similar to plant genes.
Well, it's basically biological software.
It is, and I think that's a really good example. I think most consumers are used to the idea of computer scientists tinkering with genetic codes and continually improving the software that we use and the hardware that we use. And this same type of tinkering has been carried out in agriculture for 10,000 years, but it's something that people are much less aware of. And I think that's primarily because there's only 2% of people in the United States are farmers. So there's not a really good familiarity often with the types of challenges that farmers face or the kinds of very diverse crop varieties that farmers use.
Well, we live in an era of unprecedented productivity, at least here in the United States when it comes to farming. but that's not the case all over the world. And there are some amazing examples of products that have really changed the way people live. I think golden rice is one of the biggest success stories in modern genetic engineering. Even Pope Francis came out and endorsed it. Tell us the golden rice story. What's that all about?
Well, golden rice is actually a very important story. So there's a large number of people around the world that are suffering from vitamin A deficiency. So the estimate is something like 500,000 children go blind every year because they don't have enough vitamin A in their diet, and half of these children will die every year. But it's not something we think about in the United States because, for the most part, most children have access to a fairly diverse diet. They have a lot of fruits and vegetables that are rich in vitamin A. But in less developed parts of the world, there are very, very limited diets. They're very often very poor. They don't have
not much diversity.
Not much diversity. They don't have. There's poverty, so there's not funds to buy diverse crops. And so the idea of genetically engineered golden rice developed through a grant from the nonprofit Rockefeller Foundation to essentially biofortify rice. So children that get 2/3 of their daily calories from rice now can have that rice be biofortified with beta-carotenoid, which is a precursor of vitamin A. And it's something we take for granted here. We have salt that's iodized. We have milk that's enriched for vitamin D. We have bread enriched with iron. And we don't really even think about it. But children in a less developed world don't have access to this type of diversity. And so golden rice is a rice that's been genetically engineered to produce a provitamin A, and then it's metabolized into vitamin A in the body. And it's a very exciting project. It's been available the prototypes were developed already 15 years ago. And now these genes have been introduced into many different rice varieties that are adapted to local growing conditions. So it's a very important potential contribution to the diet of many people around the world.
Now, your own science is in the rice area. I understand you've worked on making rice crops more flood resistant, which surprises me because I thought all rice lived in flooded paddies. So I need a little education on that. What problem are you trying to solve with your research?
Well, we do work on flood tolerance, and so you're right. Most rice varieties do grow in what we call rice paddies, and so they're growing in standing water. But virtually all rice varieties will die if they're completely submerged in water for more than 3 days. And this is a particular problem in South and Southeast Asia because flooding occurs regularly and can really devastate a field, and the water can stand for quite a long time. It's estimated that 4 million tons of rice, enough to feed 30 million people, is lost every year to floods. And that loss is largely in areas where people are living on less than $1 a day. So it really has a huge impact on the daily lives of farmers in those areas. So a colleague of mine developed a variety that was tolerant of flooding. And this was actually an ancient variety that has been around for a long, long time, 2,000 years. It had an incredible property. It could stay completely submerged for 2 weeks, and then after the floodwaters subsides, the rice can continue to grow.
And that was a naturally occurring rice?
Yes. So using conventional breeding, breeders tried to introduce this trait into varieties favored by farmers because farmers don't grow this old variety. It doesn't yield well. It doesn't taste well. And so breeders tried to develop a new variety carrying this flood tolerance trait into the varieties favored by farmers. But they were never able to create a variety that farmers would accept. And that's because in conventional breeding, not only do you drag in the trait you're interested in, but because you have no knowledge of the genetic makeup,
it's hit or miss.
You drag in a lot of other genes that are undesirable. And so a number of years ago, a colleague of mine had roughly pinpointed the gene that encodes this trait on the genome And we thought if we could isolate this gene, we could then introduce the gene very, very precisely into varieties favored by farmers, either through a marker-assisted breeding approach or genetic engineering approach. And that project has been quite successful. We were able to isolate the gene. We know exactly what type of protein it encodes. And at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, they use that genetic information to precisely introduce the gene into a number of different varieties. And last year, about 4 million farmers grew this new flood-tolerant rice. And they see yields increasing about threefold when there are floods. So a single gene can have a dramatic impact on the amount of grain that a farmer can harvest.
Sort of a pinpoint addition to improve yields. And I think one of the other traits that they have successfully engineered into crops is insect resistance or resistance to various herbicides. And I guess the goal was to reduce the total amount of herbicide use. Is that not correct?
Well, there's a couple of different traits. So the first one is insect resistance, as you mentioned. And there is a very interesting bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis that is very toxic to pests that attack different crops, such as corn and cotton. And organic farmers use this bacteria to try to control the pests. And
oh, they do?
Yeah. What organic farmers do is they spray it. There's big vats of this bacteria are grown up. It's dried and sold to organic farmers, and then they spray it on the crop.
Don't they worry that if their customers eat the bacteria, it might hurt them?
Well, it's considered non-toxic to humans. It's non-toxic to humans. It's very narrow spectrum. And so it's essentially harmless. And this is one of the reasons that geneticists decided to use this to engineer corn and cotton and other crops for insect resistance. And that's also been very, very successful. So now most of the corn grown in the United States is engineered with this protein. So essentially the corn crop makes its own organic pest control. And the USDA just put out a report a couple months ago indicating that just due to this genetically engineered corn called BT corn, farmers have sprayed tenfold less insecticides over the last 15 years. So it has been very, very successful in reducing use of insecticide and also reducing insecticide-related illnesses among farmers. Among workers.
You would think the environmentalists would celebrate this, and yet they seem to be almost borderline hysterical about claims that this kind of stuff is going to cause cancer in consumers. Have there been any peer-reviewed scientific papers that demonstrated harm from eating GMO crops?
No, there's no harm from eating GMO crops, and every scientific agency around the world, including the European Food Safety Authority, the National Academy of Sciences, has concluded that the crops currently on the market are safe to eat. And I think it's important to consider that each crop has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So the process of genetic engineering doesn't introduce any unique risks as compared to conventional breeding. What really matters is what is the trait that's being introduced and what does it do? And I think environmentalists have really very much celebrated BT corn because of the massive reduction in insecticide. It's a very well-known story. But I do see that there are many activists or consumers that aren't fully informed that don't realize about this massive reduction in insecticide use. And so I always try to encourage consumers to get their own first-hand science-based information. And I think this USDA Economic Research Service report is really very, very useful to look at because it summarizes the use of BT in genetic engineering.
You know, there was a study that came out apparently linking GMO corn to rat tumors. I remember there was an outpouring of criticism from the broader scientific community, and the paper was later retracted, yet it created all sorts of alarm. You can still find it on the internet. The pictures are pretty amazing. You know, where does that work stand?
Well, that work was retracted. They use rats that develop tumors anyway, and that data has been looked at by hundreds and hundreds of scientists, and there's no statistical significance indicating that eating this particular corn is going to cause cancer. It's important to realize there always will be some kind of web report or something that's out there to scare people. And we see that with every scientific issue. So if you consider global climate change, 97% of scientists have concluded that due to human activities, the climate is warming. And yet it's taken sort of as a political issue rather than a scientific issue. And often it's the right wing of the United States population that rejects that science. But on the left, we see the same type of rejection of science, and we see that with plant genetics. So rejecting the science-based information that the crops currently on the market are safe to eat and that they've reduced insecticide. But we also see it with the vaccine debate. Many people on the left reject the science that vaccines have saved many, many lives, and that they're worried that vaccination can be linked to other diseases, even though there's no scientific evidence for that. So it is difficult for consumers. You go on the internet, you can find any kind of story about science that you want, and so it is really important to get that science-based information from our leading academic nonprofit agencies such as the National Research Council, the National Academy of Sciences, the USDA, and et cetera.
Well, notwithstanding, the Europeans continue to have pretty restrictive rules about GMO crops, and there have been many attempts to force food producers to label products as having GMO material in them. We've seen various initiatives in states like California where voters were pushing to label GMO foods. I think that particular one failed, California Proposition 37. Where do we stand on labeling, and what's the criticism against labeling?
Well, first, I think it's really important to understand that the scientists in Europe made the same conclusions as the scientists in the rest of the world. It's not that the science changes as you cross the ocean. The European Food Safety Authority has concluded that the crops currently on the market are safe to eat, and many have diverse environmental benefits, and it's well known that many of the future crops, including golden rice, will likely save lives. So there is no scientific dispute. It's more a political kind of dispute, a marketing dispute, and there are, in Europe, different countries are making different laws. So now there will be some countries growing genetically engineered crops, and other countries will continue using older techniques such as spraying insecticides, and many of these insecticides are considered to be carcinogenic or potentially carcinogenic. But some countries are making those choices rather than growing, for example, BT corn, which is massively reduced insecticide use. And so the labeling is really very difficult subject for many consumers because the labels are not informative. We all want as consumers to know our food is safe to eat, that it's safe for the environment, that it's safe for farm workers. I think there's general consensus that these are very important issues to most consumers. And I think it makes sense to have a label that would provide this type of information. And so myself and many others have been advocating kind of a barcoding system so consumers can see how the crop was developed and how it's grown. But that's very controversial because there is, of course, very intensive lobbying from different aspects of the food industry to label differently. And so I think that's going to be a continuing discussion over the years.
You know, you've stated that the goal that we're all working toward is to feed the 9 billion people expected to inhabit the planet by 2050. Aren't there other approaches to solving this problem? I mean, John Holdren, the current director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, basically President Obama's science czar, back in 1997 co-authored a book with Pearl Ehrlich that recommended both forced abortions and putting infertility drugs in the water supply to cut down on population growth. Can't the problem also be solved by having fewer people on the planet?
Well, I'm not familiar with that study, but one of the key challenges of our time is to feed the growing population without further destroying the environment. There is no doubt this is a very complicated issue. The increase in the human population presents social, economic, environmental, and political issues that must be addressed. And certainly birth control is an important part of this equation. But we do have 7 billion people on the planet now. And in order to feed the humanitarian goal that I hope that we all share is that every child has sufficient food to eat. And so certainly we need to reduce growth of human population, but how do we feed the population that is here now? And how do we do it in an environmentally sustainable manner? And so really those are the issues that many people are working on all around the world. And there's no doubt that, a sustainable agriculture is very important for addressing those issues.
So, Pam, your husband's an organic farmer. You live, breathe, and eat foods that are grown in that manner. You're a plant geneticist. How do you two work together, and where can you find harmony in those two technologies?
Well, Raul and I believe that to advance sustainable agriculture, we need to use the most appropriate technologies. So that the discussions about agriculture must be framed in the context of the environmental, economic, and social impacts of agriculture, which are the 3 pillars of sustainable agriculture. So rather than focusing on how a seed variety was developed, we really have to ask the important questions. What most enhances local food security? How can we provide safe, nutritious food to consumers? We must ask if rural communities can thrive, if farmers can make a profit. We have to be sure that consumers can afford the food, and we must minimize environmental degradation. So this includes conserving land and water, enhancing farm biodiversity and soil fertility, reducing erosion, and minimizing harmful inputs.
So you're making the radical proposal that we face these problems rationally.
Exactly. Exactly.
Very good. Pam, thanks so much for being on the show, and do keep in touch.
Well, thanks for your time.
That was Dr. Pamela Arnold, UC Davis Professor of Plant Genetics and author of Tomorrow's Table, Organic Farming, Genetics, and the Future of Food, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Ahead, family farmer Martha Bonita describes her travails with local zoning regulators whose spying on her Facebook page resulted in threats of thousands in fines, an IRS audit, ongoing litigation, and ultimately statewide legislation designed to protect Virginia family farmers from just such harassment. Stay tuned.